Thanks for coming out on a wonderful sunny day. You know, that's tough competition this time of year, is when it's a little nice outside, but it's so great to see so many people coming out for this program. So, my name is Dr. Jacob Rohrm. I do public programs here at the History Center, and I'm really excited for today. This is one of our programs associated with our Sherlock exhibit, which if you haven't seen, you have very limited time. It closes next weekend. And as you can see, the weekends have been very busy with that exhibit. So if you do want to see it and you haven't, late on the weekday afternoons or Thursday evenings is a good time. So, yeah, and with that exhibit, we've really been trying to look at all the different ways that Sherlock has been a significant figure in history, even though he's fictional. But we're also looking at the ways that Sherlock helps us understand the historical inquiry process. And think about how is history like detective work, and where does it differ? Because it's not one-to-one lining up. Sherlock is a fun character, but he's not a great historian. So today's event really helps us dig into that question of how history is detective work. So I want to also mention that a lot of times when we have a guest speaker, we have something that they're talking about that's a finished product, that they're done with, that they've published a book or an article or whatever. This is a really great opportunity to hear about something that's still in process. However, it is getting close to being a final product, and Dr. Lehman will be having a book about this coming out next year from MNHS Press, so keep your eyes peeled for that. So today we really get to be like Watson following in Sherlock's footsteps as we go along to sort of see how a very difficult topic like Eliza Winston, who was not really someone that the historical record normally wanted to document the life of, how do you go about learning and navigating that record? So I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to introduce a little bit about the historical event that provides the sort of jumping off point for today's talk. So Dr. Christopher Lehman is a professor in the Department of Ethnic, Gender, and Women's Studies at St. Cloud State University. He's the author of multiple books, including Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State, Power, Politics, and the Decline of the Civil Rights Movement, A Fragile Coalition, 1967 to 1973, Slavery in the Upper Mississippi Valley, 1787 to 1865, A History of Human Bondage in Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And lest you think he only works on the history of slavery and civil rights, he's also written a critical history of Soul Train on television, which I love that diversity. And also with us is Dr. Chantel Rodriguez. She's the senior public historian here at MNHS. Prior to joining MNHS, she was an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland at College Park and a research associate at the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of American History. She's published articles in scholarly journals and is currently at work on two projects. One is an article on the history of death investigation in Minnesota, and the other is a book on migrant worker health in the Midwest. So before letting them come up here and take over the show, I want to give you a little background on the story of Eliza Winston. So because our program today is primarily focused on the historical research process rather than a detailed recounting of Eliza Winston's story as we know it, I want to make sure that we all are on the same page. Winston was an enslaved African-American woman owned by Mississippian Richard Christmas. In the summer of 1860, the Christmas family vacationed at the Winslow House Hotel, which is in St. Anthony, which is now part of Minneapolis on the other side of the falls from downtown Minneapolis. As they vacationed, they brought Winston with them. The Winslow House was a popular vacation spot for Southern families, part of a tourist economy here in Minnesota that catered to Southern slaveholders. Slavery may have been banned in Minnesota, but the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in the 1857 Dred Scott case meant that an enslaved person could not become free simply because he or she lived in a state that banned slavery. The Dred Scott ruling reassured Southern slaveholders that they could travel to free states like Minnesota with their enslaved servants. But the issue of slavery was a polarizing one, and Northern judges did not always abide by the Dred Scott decision. While Winston was in St. Anthony, she was approached by Emily Goodridge Gray, a free African-American woman who connected her to abolitionists. They helped Winston file a legal complaint to gain her freedom. In her complaint, Eliza asserted that she was, quote, being restrained of her liberty by her master. Eliza's legal complaint sparked immediately conflict. Pro-slavery community members feared that the freeing of Eliza Winston would harm the tourist industry and deter Southern slaveholders from vacationing in Minnesota. When the abolitionist judge Charles E. Vanderburg ruled in Eliza's favor, the courtroom erupted in chaos and the crowd outside swelled as anti-abolitionists protested the decision. That evening, a threatening gang of pro-slavery agitators surrounded the house where Winston was staying, but by then she had disappeared. The story of Eliza Winston is a fascinating one, but how does a historian do the work of finding sources for an enslaved woman who left behind very few records herself and who disappeared after gaining her freedom in 1860? So let's find out. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Lehman and Dr. Chantel Rodriguez to the stage.
Thank you for that introduction, Jacob. Again, my name is Chantel, and I'm very excited that y'all are here with us to have this conversation with Dr. Chris Lehman. The process of doing historical work is a lot like detective work. Like detectives, historians must ask questions, they gather clues or sources, they analyze those sources to extract evidence, and they draw conclusions. Unlike detectives, historians don't end with their conclusions. History is an ongoing process, and we often have to revisit that and update it as we go forward. So in my conversation with Dr. Lehman today, we're going to learn about his detective work, the historical research that he did to try and figure out the story of Eliza Winston. So to get us started with the softball question, I'm going to ask Dr. Lehman how you got interested in this topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob, for the introduction. Thank you to the Historical Society for inviting me here today. I became interested in the topic, I think, in the summer of 2021, because that is when I learned that the police officers who killed Breonna Taylor in her own home were not going to be criminally charged. And when I learned that news, one of the things that popped into my head was this question of how African American women view the justice system. And what I was hoping I could find was an example of an African American woman seeking justice for herself with the justice system that this country has and actually finding it. And I knew from my research for Slavery's Reach that there were examples of African American women who sued for their freedom and won their freedom. There were the cases of Rachel and Courtney, who were enslaved in the Northwest in forts, and then taken down to Missouri. And Missouri is where they sued for their freedom and won. I also knew about Eliza Winston, but that she had been taken from the state of Mississippi to here in Minnesota. And it was in Minnesota where she sued and won. And when trying to figure out among those three people which person to write about, I found that when it came to Eliza Winston, she was the only one who had a source that she herself had written. I was not able to find one for Rachel or Courtney. So since there was the most information from Eliza in her own words, that's who I decided to go with. Also, after I had written Slavery's Reach and was starting to give talks about the book, one of the things that I would hear from people who had read the book was that, however they thought of my research, they were frustrated that I didn't give them someone to root for in Slavery's Reach. And that's a good frustration because if you look at the subtitle, the book is about Southern slaveholders in the North Star State. So if you're rooting for the Southern slaveholders, then, well, you know, that's your prerogative. But if you're not, then I can understand why. So I figured, well, for people who are looking for a hero in Slavery's Reach and didn't find it, then they could at least know that Eliza Winston is the protagonist and hopefully someone that you would root for.
So once you sort of figured out that you wanted to write a book about Eliza Winston, you know, historians have to figure out what questions are you going to ask. So what kind of research questions did you start with? Did you have one? Did you have several? And how did you come up with these?
Well, I already knew that she had sued for her freedom and won. So my main question was, what was Eliza Winston's path to freedom? How did she know about the possibility of freedom in Minnesota? And then how did she get it? Who were the people in Minnesota who helped her receive that freedom? Who were the people who stood in her way? And in the meantime, what was it about her enslavement that made her seek her freedom? Because not every person who was enslaved actively sought their freedom, but Eliza did. So my two main questions were, what was Eliza's path to freedom, and what was her enslaved like? The title for the upcoming book is Eliza Winston, An Enslaved Life, because her years of enslavement are the focus of the book in order to get to the point when she is actively seeking her freedom.
So you have these two big research questions. I'm curious to know a bit more about what do you think makes a good research question?
I think what makes a good research question is a question in which, like you said, you're not going to find all the answers, but you want to find as many answers as possible, and you want those answers to improve your understanding of the topic that you're interested in. And I had no idea about Eliza Winston's life other than what was in her affidavit, and I was eagerly wanting to find out more about her, and whatever I could find about her life as an enslaved person in Minnesota and in Mississippi, and before that in Tennessee, because she mentions Tennessee in her affidavit. And I think that when you look at as many new resources as possible, and you're open to using those resources, that's a great help for any researcher. I knew that I could look at databases for old newspapers, whether it's from a free site like Chronicling America or a pay site like newspapers.com. Also, I'm an amateur family historian, so the skills that I've used in my amateur genealogy have also become helpful in the research for this book. And new resources also include people whose perspectives have been left out of scholarship about history up until this point. And that includes scholars of color, that includes people of color, women whose sources, or at least whose quotes or whose stories in old newspapers would not have gotten as much attention because of who they were.
Great, so you have these two questions, and now you face the conundrum that all historians face, which is how do you answer them? Oftentimes historians, they have their questions, and now they have to develop an action plan. They need to figure out, where do I start? What kind of secondary or primary sources can help me start answering those questions? So I'd like to hear more about how you started your research. Was there a specific collection or archive that you knew that you absolutely needed to start with first, and why?
Well, yes, there was, and that source was William Greene's great book, A Peculiar Imbalance. That was the first time I've ever read about Eliza Winston. And after reading Greene's book, I knew that he had published a couple of articles about Eliza Winston earlier, one of which is in Minnesota History Magazine from the year 2000. So I definitely used that as a source as well. And from those sources, I was able to get a lot of information about Eliza's story in Minnesota and in Mississippi just before then, because that was what Dr. Greene talked about. And as a result, there wasn't a whole lot of research that I had to do in Minnesota proper. But what I wanted to do after having read Greene's work was to see how much I could find out about what Eliza would have experienced in her enslavement in Minnesota. What would she have experienced while she was on a steamboat going from Mississippi all the way up to Minnesota. And then what would she have experienced as an enslaved person in St. Anthony or Minneapolis at the Winslow Hotel? What would an enslaved person in a hotel in Minnesota do? Where would they stay? And also, what would they eat? So one of the things that I found in the archives here in this building was an old menu from the Winslow Hotel from around the time that Eliza would have stayed there. So I was able to look at the different fish that would have been served, like crappie and so forth, and know that that was something that Eliza would have eaten. And that led me to asking another question, which would have been, well, what would Eliza have thought coming from the South and eating Southern food, you know, what we call soul food, and then coming up to Minnesota and eating the local Minnesota food? Of course, there's no way to answer that question, but knowing that she experienced that cultural shift, maybe even cultural shock, was part of how I came to understand Eliza's story here.
I absolutely love that you start with these big questions, but then as soon as you start looking at sources, all of a sudden you have all these other questions. And maybe they're not as big of questions, but they become important, right? To be able to tell the lived experience of someone like Eliza, you know, just thinking about the fact that she was at a hotel and you want to know what kind of food they were being served and what she would have thought of that, you know, and those are just constant questions that keep coming up and you have to keep track of those and they lead you down more rabbit holes, right? So that leads me to the question of what other sources did you start using to try and tease out maybe some of those bigger questions or other questions that popped up as you were doing this research?
Well, once I received confirmation from Dr. Green's work that Eliza indeed was enslaved in Mississippi and in Tennessee, I had to read books that were secondary sources about the history of slavery in Mississippi and Tennessee in order to get a general sense of what Eliza's life would have been like as an enslaved person in those states. Knowing that she came from Mississippi to Minnesota by water, I had to read secondary books about steamboat travel to find out what that was like in general, and then what that would have been like for enslaved people, what that would have been like for anyone coming from the South to Minnesota. And one of the interesting things that I learned was that anyone who wanted to go from the deep South to Minnesota would actually have to take two different boats. They would have to go on a boat from the deep South to St. Louis. And once the boat reached St. Louis, everybody aboard had to disembark. And then they would have to find a boat that would go from St. Louis further up north. And that's because St. Louis was the last stop in a enslaved state. And if anyone who was enslaved, who was, let's say, part of the crew of that boat, went any farther, went even up to Illinois, let alone Iowa and Minnesota, they were in waters by free states. And so they could easily get off the boat and then set their foot on dry land that was free land and be free. So that's why there had to be two separate boats, one that went to St. Louis and then one that left from St. Louis.
Wow, that's really interesting. How did you figure that out? How did you realize that there were two separate steamboats and that, you know, they had sort of different purposes sort of based on slave law?
Mm-hmm. Well, the secondary literature that I read about steamboats mentioned that. And then I did the work of going through old newspapers and finding the schedules for when steamboats were about to depart. And those advertisements and those schedules mentioned all the different stops, and the ones that were just sailing within the Deep South only had Deep South stops. So it wasn't until I looked at newspapers from St. Louis that I learned that there were boats leaving St. Louis that had northern destinations. And then there were boats leaving St. Louis going back to the south that had southern destinations.
That's really exciting. It sounds like you could possibly use that information, like steam schedules and everything, to almost like map a way of abolitionism, right, along the river and the towns along the way.
Right.
That's really exciting. I hope you do that project after this one. I'd love to read that.
Thank you.
Just add it to your list. I know you have a lot of ideas. But you mentioned newspapers, so I'm curious to hear more about the different kinds of sources. You've mentioned secondary sources, now some newspapers. Did you rely a lot on newspapers? Did you end up using other kinds of maybe legal documents that helped you to tell the story?
Well, I would say that the primary sources that I looked at the most were sources that were from different counties, especially in Tennessee. I found the most having to do with Eliza specifically in Tennessee, more so than in Mississippi. And what I found especially helpful were deeds, similar to when I was working on slavery's reach. But instead of real estate deeds that I was researching in Minnesota, I found deeds that recorded the sales of people in Tennessee. And so I was able to find names of the people that Eliza mentioned in her affidavit as the slaveholders, and I was able to find deeds that mentioned Eliza by name as a person being sold. Also from the county records, I was able to find tax listings or tax records, because back then, everyone who was in the county who was a taxpayer had the amount of tax that they paid recorded. And part of those tax records included a designation of how many enslaved people a person held. And I was able to determine whether Eliza was held by a certain enslaver at one point based on the number of enslaved people that were listed under specific enslavers' names. And again, I looked at old newspapers in order to find not only the schedules for the steamboats, but also to find examples of quotes from the people who were being researched for the story. At one point, I even found a couple of instances where Eliza was listed by her last name as well as her first name because she was receiving a piece of mail. And back then, the post offices would list in the newspapers if there was a piece of mail that someone needed to pick up at the post office. And at one point in Tennessee and at another point in in Michigan, Eliza was listed by name. She was listed by her first name and one of her enslavers' names in Tennessee, but in Michigan, after she had already become freed, she was listed as Eliza Winston. So that let me know that she spent a good deal of time in Michigan after she left Minnesota.
Okay. I have a lot of questions, but I need to rein it in. So I'm really excited about the idea that you could actually find enslaved people's names in these records. So you actually found their specific names, like in the tax records, versus, because I know you talked earlier in a session before this, how like in census records, et cetera, there was no name, right? It was just enslaved person. But in this case, there's actual enslaved people's names in these records?
In the deeds, yes.
In the deeds.
In the tax records, no.
Okay.
But if you wanted to find names of enslaved people, you could find them in the deeds recording the transactions, and you could find them in probate court records, which every county has. Those probate court records would either have the record of somebody's will, in which case they would list each enslaved person by name, or if that person died without a will, then the probate court would appoint someone to take an inventory of the deceased person's property. And back then, the property included people. So in those cases, people would be listed by name as well. And I didn't find so many probate court documents with Eliza's name, but with deeds I did.
Okay, this is really, you can really start to see how the historical process is like detective work, because you start looking at all these pieces and they're just little clues, little tiny pieces that you also have to have larger knowledge about, right? So if you started with the deeds and you didn't know the tax records existed, but you did, so you were able to start putting these pieces together. These newspapers, I thought that was interesting. The fact that you thought to look at the post office, sort of announcement saying that this person has mail to pick up. More importantly, the fact that Eliza was receiving mail. Did you only find one instance that she had mail waiting for her? Do you know if anything about that mail at all, if it was personal or related to her owners?
Well, the only thing that I could gather from her receiving a piece of mail in her enslavement was that it was from February of 1853. Now, if you look at the affidavit, Eliza says that she became the property of the Christmases in March of 1853, or she says 7 years ago in March, and she's talking in 1860. So if she became the property of the Christmases in March of 1853, that would mean that a letter from 1853 that she's receiving in Tennessee would probably mean that her enslaver at that point is telling her, I need to come get you and sell you. So I think that's what the content of the letter was without being able to know what the content was.
Right. Educated guess for a possibility there.
Right, and that also implies that even though Eliza was enslaved, she knew how to read. So she was literate. And that was one of the things that I was very surprised to find about her, was that at least one or two of her enslavers gave her a lot of leeway in her enslavement to make her own choices about things, ranging from where to go to church to whom to marry in an extra legal sense. And in part of that semi-freedom, she must have learned how to read.
This whole idea of gathering the sources and now you have to start analyzing them, which is exactly what you're talking about, being able to make inferences to pull out of these kinds of sources. And what I'm really curious about with your research is the fact that, again, you're writing a book about Eliza Winston, the biggest challenge being that she left behind little records herself, so how do you tell a story about someone of which she left behind so little records, and then, of course, disappears from the historical record. So let's dig into this whole, how do you analyze these sources to get the information that you need to tell a story, right? So you mentioned a little bit earlier that you actually did find perhaps a source or two written by Eliza herself. So can you talk a bit about that source or sources and how you were able to extract information from that?
Certainly. Well, the affidavit that Eliza wrote was in August of 1860, so this was around the time that she was in court petitioning for her freedom. In this affidavit, she mentions at least a couple of the people who were her enslavers before the Christmases were. She mentions that she was enslaved in Tennessee and in Mississippi before coming to Minnesota. She mentions that the Christmases had promised her her freedom, and so she received clothing from her friends, her late husband's friends, and she said that she bought some herself as well. And so she packed a wardrobe for her new life in freedom. We know that the promise was not kept by the Christmases. We know that Emily Gray helped her in finding people in Minnesota who would help her be free. We know that when the sheriff came to free her, she had a disagreement with Mrs. Christmas, Mary. Her name was actually Merry Christmas, believe it or not. So she had a disagreement with Merry Christmas, but left with the sheriff. And then, we also know that Eliza felt close to Merry Christmas's daughter, Norma, and that if there were a way for Eliza's promise of freedom to be trusted, then she would have been willing to stay with the Christmases. So those were the basics that I already knew from reading the affidavit. So what I wanted to figure out was, what was it that was left out that I could still find out by digging into the little information that that Eliza gave us. And so what I wanted to do was to start with the surnames. In the affidavit, there is a mention of someone named Mr. Macklemore and someone else named Mr. Golson. And in the affidavit, Eliza says that Mr. Macklemore was the first enslaver and that Mr. Golson came afterward. But that transition only happened, as far as Eliza's concerned, when Mr. Golson married Mr. Macklemore's daughter. So I knew, again, doing family tree research, that one of the things that you can do with Ancestry.com is plug in the name of an ancestor and plug in the name of someone you think is the ancestor's spouse and get more information about them. So what I did was plug in the name Golson, plug in the name Macklemore as a spouse, plug in the state Tennessee, and then see what came up. And I was able to find at least one person who had a family tree who listed someone named Golson and someone named Macklemore in their tree. And that person's family tree also had a document attached to the tree, and that document is a marriage record from a Thomas Golson to a Catherine Macklemore. And when I did research to see if there were census records of anyone named Golson in Tennessee, Thomas Golson came up. And he was the only Thomas Golson who came up in that part of Tennessee, so I figured this must be the Thomas Golson who's Mr. Golson, and this must be the daughter of Mr. Macklemore. And then going on from there, I was able to find out who Mr. Macklemore was. His first name was John, and I just kept digging from there.
Okay, I love that you have these examples up here for us. Can you offer up just a bit more context about the affidavit? So can you explain for folks that don't know what an affidavit is and why it holds so much value as a historical record?
Yes, it's a sworn statement that is given to a court for a particular case. Now, in the case for Eliza Winston, what happened with her in the North was that there's this process called writ of habeas corpus. And people who were abolitionists, people who were fighting against slavery, used the writ of habeas corpus if they knew of cases in which people were enslaved in the North and they shouldn't be. So with the writ of habeas corpus, what would happen is a sheriff would go to where the enslaved person was in the North and arrest that enslaved person. But what that did was take the enslaved person away from the slaveholders and put that person either in a county jail or directly to the courthouse, which is what happened with Eliza. So the writ was used in the case of Eliza Winston.
And remind us again, this affidavit, she was able to put this forth after the abolitionist came to speak with her.
Correct.
The Winston. Okay.
Right, so her abolitionist allies had to apply for the writ for her, and then the judge said, Judge Vandenberg said, okay, let's bring her in. So the judge sent the sheriff, Richard Strout, to arrest Eliza and bring her to the courthouse.
Were you able to find any additional information about that sort of experience of her being brought in by the sheriff, the sort of implications of policing that kind of you sort of started out with, and how the sheriff was involved with this whole process?
One of the interesting things I found out about the sheriff was that he actually was one of the people in Minnesota who did business with slaveholders. And I didn't know that when I was writing Slavery's Reach. But one of the things I learned in reading about Richard Strout was that he co-founded the town of Cold Spring with a man by the name of Benjamin Joden, who, I'm sorry, not Benjamin Joden, but Benjamin Joden's wife. But the Jodens were people who had come from Virginia, and they had been slaveholders in Virginia. And I think one of the censuses also lists their household as having a Southern African American living with them. So they might have even practiced it in Minnesota. But regardless, they were slaveholders. They had money from slavery. And Sarah Joden, Benjamin's wife, used some of that money to help found the town of Cold Spring. And Sheriff Stroud was in on that with her. So he was in this awkward position of doing business with Southerners, and now here the judge is sending him to take a slave away, basically.
Wow. So when it came to trying to sort of figure out and disentangle the sort of chaos that happened around Eliza Winston's case, were you mostly relying on newspapers? Had there been interviews done at the time to sort of capture, who felt like they were on the side of the judge and the abolitionists, and who was obviously not on that side? What sort of sources did you use to sort of figure that out?
Well, the newspapers were very helpful because they were very politically divided. I mean, we talk about political division now, but you could definitely tell based on who was an editor of a paper whether that was going to be a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery paper. And that's in Minnesota as well. I mean, there are people who were definitely not going to enslave people in Minnesota because it's just not practical to do that. But they certainly supported the right of someone else to enslave if they wanted to in the South. So there were pro-slavery papers in Minnesota as well as anti-slavery ones. And based on which source I was using to find quotes, I could determine accuracy, more or less, about what I was reading in terms of the words that people were printing.
Yeah, that brings me to this other question I had. I'm going to really talk about this question of historical accuracy or historical truth. So what happens when you end up finding sources that perhaps may not be reliable, in the sense that they're pro-slavery or something to that effect? How do you deal with that as a historian? Do you just say, I can't use that anymore? Or do you find a way to, read it effectively?
Mm-hmm. Well, I came across that when I decided that I would read one of the sources that I kept coming across in the literature, which was this article written by a man named Harry Remington, who had written an article about Eliza Winston in, I think, 1934. And the article gives the basics of Eliza Winston's life fairly accurately. But as it turns out, what Remington wrote was actually a transcript of a radio drama that one of the stations in Minnesota had performed about the whole Eliza Winston incident. And because it was something that the Historical Society had mentioned as a promotion, and it was something that came from a reporter for one of the Twin Cities newspapers, it was given a certain amount of gravitas. But among the things that Remington just made up was, for one thing, that Eliza Winston had a husband named Jim Winston. Eliza doesn't mention her husband's name in the affidavit. None of the sources I looked at where abolitionists are being quoted mention that. I looked in census records for free people named Jim Winston in 1850 and could not find it. I looked for newspapers that would have mentioned Jim Winston's death. I couldn't find any mention of that name. So there was no way that Harry Remington in Minnesota, without the benefit of the web, would find someone named Jim Winston if I can't find it with the World Wide Web in 2023. So that was one of the things that was just made up for dramatic effect. Also, Remington said that Eliza Winston had a nervous tic of using profanity, and he referred to Eliza Winston as a hefty mammy when old newspapers are all over the place about what she looked like. Some people called her a beautiful well, they used the word mulatto back then, and others referred to her as dark and hefty and old as well. So it was just impossible to use biased sources and to use Remington's article for anything that didn't corroborate what Eliza had written in the affidavit already.
Yeah, I think that's, you're hitting on one of the most important things that a historian needs to do when they look at a source, is to always be on their guard and never take anything for face value. You always have to be careful, and you always have to corroborate, like you're saying. That is the key. And I think sometimes, like you're saying, I think that there's just so much out there that you can't get a sense for what she looks like, right? And maybe we won't ever know what she looks like, and that just will remain one of the mysteries of Eliza Winston. And I know that as a historian, you feel that it's important to convey that to your readers or the people who are reading your book, right? That you can just be clear about the messiness of the reality that these sources are not all on the same page about this, and we can actually offer up some analysis about that, about why there's sort of different opinions about what she may have or may not have looked like. This is making me think about all the different sources that you've used. It sounds like you have such a diversity of them in terms of type, but also in terms of the content of them. So I'm curious to hear more about perhaps what are the most surprising or unexpected sources that you found during your research, and what made it so unexpected or surprising?
Okay. Well, one of the things that surprised me was learning that part of Eliza's enslavement in Tennessee involved a sitting U.S. president, Andrew Jackson. So in my research, I learned that John McLemore was married to Betsy Donaldson, who was the niece of Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel Donaldson. And Andrew Jackson loved his in-laws, like very much. There are stories about Jackson allowing people in the Donaldson family into the White House. For example, Jackson's wife died just before he went to Washington for his first term. So he allowed for his late wife's youngest sister and one of his nieces, one of his wife's nieces or great nieces, to be co-first ladies. And so John McLemore married into the Donaldson family, and Jackson loved the McLemore Donaldsons as well. Now, in 1834, McLemore came into some financial trouble, and he had to sell all his enslaved people, and Eliza was one of them. And they were sold to, not all of them, but I think Eliza and two other people were sold to a man named Lucius Polk, who's the first cousin of another president, James Polk. But Lucius Polk was also married to one of those co-first ladies, I think Mary Ann Easton. So that was, I think, in early 1834. In the fall of 1834, Andrew Jackson leaves Washington, D.C. to go to his mansion, the Hermitage, in Tennessee for a visit. And while he's there, he decides that his friend John McLemore is so broke that he needs to arrange for at least one of his, or all three of the slaves that went to Lucius Polk to go to McLemore's kids. So he has two daughters. One is Mary, and the other is Catherine. And Jackson decides to give two slaves to Mary and one slave, Eliza, to Catherine. But in 1834, Catherine is 12 years old. So Jackson stipulates that Catherine can't receive Eliza until Catherine gets married. So Eliza leaves the McLemores, goes to the Polks in 1834, spends 8 years there, And then in 1842, she sent to Catherine Donaldson Golson and her husband Thomas Golson. And I had found a deed from 1842 in Tennessee that showed Eliza going from Lucius Polk to Catherine Golson. And it was in that deed where Lucius mentions that I am doing this because of an arrangement with Andrew Jackson. I thought, what, the president? And it turned out it was the president. So that was the most surprising thing.
That's amazing. I love that you were able to follow up on that lead, because sometimes you see that and you go, nah, it couldn't be, right? And then you go on and you've missed a whole trail. But I commend you for continuing to follow the breadcrumbs on that one that resulted in. I think an ability to tell a story about, like you said, your big question is telling the story of enslavement of Eliza. And obviously you can't tell it after the moment she drops off the record, but trying to do so in her earlier years. I'm glad that was able to come to fruition through that. You know, one of the questions that came to my mind as you were talking was, you mentioned that there's other secondary sources that talk about Eliza Winston, so clearly other people have written about her, which means that other people have also consulted likely some of the same sources that you have as you were doing your research for your book. So I'm curious, do you have any examples of sources that you used for your book that other people have also used in theirs, but you used it very differently?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the affidavit is the best case for that, because in the literature that I've read about Eliza Winston, people have used the affidavit to flesh out the story of Eliza in Minnesota and the people who helped her here, the people who tried to keep her enslaved here. But what I wanted to do was look at the enslavement that she talked about in Mississippi and Tennessee and find out whatever I could about that. So that was what I thought was the new approach, or the different approach I was taking, which was to focus on the years of slavery before she comes to Minnesota. Now, one thing I found in the affidavit that didn't quite match with the research was that Eliza said in the affidavit that she was 30 years old, which would have put her birth in 1830. But in the deed where I found where Macklemore lost all his enslaved people, Eliza is listed as 17 years old instead of 4 years old. And I had found the deed in which Macklemore had bought Eliza in the first place, and that was from 1822. And in that deed, there's a person named Eliza who's listed as 5 years old, which matches someone who would have been born in 1817 and therefore be 5 years old in 1822 and 17 years old in 1834. So I was shocked to find that out, but since that seemed to be what tracked, I just went with that. And I decided to make Eliza's birth year 1817 and not 1830 for the book, because in looking at that deed, the only person named Eliza who's sold is someone who's 17 years old. I had entertained the idea, well, maybe Eliza had a baby who was also named Eliza, but that baby still would have been 4 years old, and that baby would have been sold because all the property, all the slaves were sold, but there's no 4-year-old girl named Eliza in the deed. So Eliza, or the Eliza that I'm looking at, has to be the 17-year-old instead.
Okay, so I've got a lot of questions. Again, okay, so when it comes to inconsistencies in birth years for enslaved peoples, is that something that's common across, that scholars have to deal with in scholarship all the time? And generally speaking, within the actual context of it, why was there such an issue with determining how old an enslaved person was? How important was age to the enslavement process?
Mm-hmm. Well, age was very important because, just last month I was reading about slavery in Louisiana because my father's side of the family is from there. And I learned that sometime in the 1820s, Louisiana passed a law that an enslaver or a slave broker could not sell a person if that person was under 10 years old, or at least they couldn't sell that person individually. If that person was younger than 10 years old, that person had to be sold with his or her mother. But once that person was 10 years old, they didn't have to be. So age was very important. Age determined a person's price as well. Teenagers tended to, well, actually, I think the elderly and the youngest of children sold alone would have been worth, or they would have been valued with the least amount of money. The elderly because they're past their prime in physical health and they're only starting to decline in terms of being able to physically work. Kids, they're not terribly strong, but at least they'll grow and become stronger. So it goes elderly, then children, then teenagers, then young adults. And of course, young adults would have been the highest price. You could easily buy a person for $1,000, which should be like around $20,000 in today's money. So those would be the highest price people to buy.
Okay, so when it comes to Eliza, let's say she was born in 1817 rather than 1830. Was she born in the United States to enslaved parents, or?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so her birth date somehow would have been attached to, I'm not sure when she was sold away from her parents.
Well, she was sold away from her parents, or at least she was sold away from her family when Macklemore lost all the enslaved people. When she was first sold in 1822, she was actually sold with all her family. And at the time, she lived with her mother, her grandmother, one brother, an older sister and a younger sister, and some cousins. And they all went to the Macklemores, but I don't know if Macklemore sold all those family members or if they all died. But by the time the sale comes in 1834, the mother's gone, the grandmother's gone. I think the older siblings are gone too.
Okay, so when it comes to this, the records that you look at, whether it be because there's a sale that takes place, is there information on that beyond like physical characteristics of birth date or age? Are there birth records at all that get attached to enslaved peoples, or is that just not really part of the record keeping that went along with it?
Well, it depends. I mean, there were some people who kept memoranda books because they wanted to keep track of who was on their labor force. I haven't found that there was such a memo book for Macklemore, but it was common for that to happen. Another way that births of enslaved babies would be recorded would be through baptisms. And I've been able to find lots of baptismal records for my ancestors in Louisiana through a couple of Catholic churches that had digitized their baptism records and put them on Ancestry or some other website.
All right, so we've talked about the big questions you started with, how you started to gather and find your clues/sources. We looked at how you started analyzing these sources to really read against the grain to find your evidence, to try and answer those questions. And now as a historian, you have all this stuff swirling around in your head in your office. How do you put it all together? How do you start to answer those questions? Do you have like a eureka moment, or is it this like really slow process of connecting the dots?
It is a slow process. There is a lot of comparing that I did between my notes and the secondary literature that I already found. But I would say that my eureka moment in figuring out how to talk about Eliza's story was learning about how once she went to Catherine Golson and her husband, that they were the ones who gave her a lot of leeway in how to live as an enslaved person. Maybe within a couple years after they acquired Eliza, they allowed her to go to a church by herself in Memphis. And it was at this church where she worshiped with other enslaved people, but also free African Americans and European Americans who did not own anybody. So it was at that church where she probably had one of her first instances of realizing, oh, not everybody white holds slaves, and not everybody black is a slave. So once she's exposed to these people who, just by being there, show her that there are other ways to live, she's all about that, and she wants that for herself as much as possible. And for the most part, the Golsons are able to give that to her. Catherine dies before Thomas does, but Thomas gives her even more leeway because he decides that he's going to talk about the market in New Orleans for a Memphis newspaper. So he leaves Eliza alone in Tennessee for quite a bit of time. And it's during that time that Eliza meets a free person and considers herself married to him, makes plans to go to Liberia with him and start a new life there, but then he dies. And she stays in Tennessee in her freedom, though, and it's at that point where she's widowed and in Tennessee where she gets that letter in the post office. And a month later, she's the property of the Christmases, and she becomes a slave in the Deep South, which is a complete 180 from being a semi-free person in urban Memphis.
Now, I know the answers to your big questions are basically your book, and you're not going to tell us what that is because you need to publish your book and you want people to buy it. So I won't push you on that right now. But I do think it's important us to remember that even though historians are engaging in this detective work, as we do research in the archives and work with newspapers, that we differ from detectives in the sense that detectives solve the case. They objectively find an answer, but we're historians and we deal in the subjective. History is an ongoing process. It is never done. And so I'm curious to hear about any questions that you were unable to answer within the scope of your book project so far.
Yes, I was never able to find out the source of the surname Winston. I don't know if it was a married name or if it was a name of someone in Memphis whom she liked and decided to adopt that surname. As a result, I don't know the name of Eliza Winston's husband. It's definitely not Jim Winston, but I don't know the name of that husband. I don't know how long Eliza lived as a free person. I don't know how long she lived specifically in Detroit as a free person. I know that she was there at least through 1862, which would have been 2 years after her emancipation. So, I also don't know when she died. So, basically, for my research's sake, her story stops at least 2 years into her freedom. But again, the book is about her enslaved life, so I didn't feel too badly about knowing that much about what happened when she was free.
Well, that leads us into, again, history is an ongoing process, so scholars in the future might pick up new sources, new evidence buried somewhere. So what kinds of questions do you hope that future historians or researchers will be able to apply to the study of Eliza Winston or to slavery in Minnesota more broadly?
Well, I hope that researchers of the future will be able to find out more information about what it would be like living as an enslaved person in a hotel in Minnesota, and what kinds of feelings and experiences those people had sleeping on the floors of their enslavers' rooms, or what it would have been like to enter the Winslow Hotel through the back door, what it would have been like to wait for the guests who were European American to finish their meals, and then have Eliza and the other slaves of servants eat with the hotel kitchen crew. Again, what she would have felt eating the food that was in the North versus in the South. So more general information about being enslaved at a hotel in Minnesota, that would be really interesting to me for people to find out. Also, toward that end, what would it have been like for enslaved people being in Minnesota, knowing that when their enslaver's vacation is over, it's time to go back to the South and go back to definite legal enslavement instead of the vague enslavement that's in Minnesota? What kinds of feelings would people have, did people record that I just haven't found, where enslaved people are thinking, I could stay here and be free, but there's all this family I have back home, or I don't know anybody here. Unfortunately for Eliza, she didn't have any family to go back to in Mississippi. She was already all alone in Mississippi when the Christmases chose her to go to Minnesota. So she literally had nothing to lose by going for her freedom here and just staying in the North. But that wasn't the case for most enslaved people of tourists. They were plucked from their communities and they were brought to the North, had to say goodbye to their family and friends that they left behind, and be stuck with their enslaver for 3 months at the very least, because they would stay for an entire season. So I think those are stories still left to be told.
Yeah, those sound like really great examinations into the experience of racial geographies. Is what you're saying, right? The Deep South has a different experience with Jim Crow laws and what that's like, and then you come to a place like Minnesota that's different, right? Legally, different racial sort of orientation, and how that experience can radically change how someone thinks or what their experiences are and how they carried that back. And again, put that on your list. I think that would be a great book for you to write.
Thank you.
We've sort of come to the end of our conversation. Is there anything you would like to, last thoughts that you'd like to put out there before we turn it over to Q&A?
Well, certainly. One of the things that was reinforced to me when I looked at Eliza's story was just how much she represented the changes that the country was taking during her lifetime of enslavement. I mean, she starts in Tennessee, which was considered the West back in the 18 teens and 20s and 30s. And she's pushed farther from Nashville to Memphis. She also spent some time in Kentucky and Louisville, and then to Mississippi, and then ultimately to Minnesota. So she gets pushed farther and farther west. But as she's getting pushed farther and farther west, she's still a slave. And so the conditions of slavery keep changing the farther west she goes, but her condition of enslavement does not.
That's a great note to end on. I hope people have some questions for Dr. Lehman. Thank you, Dr. Lehman, for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So early in the conversation, you mentioned you found Eliza listed on in a newspaper list of mail in Michigan. How did you happen to be looking at Michigan newspapers?
Well, what I did was I went to newspapers.com and I put the name Eliza Winston in quotes, and I think I used some antebellum years as the period for the newspaper website to search, and then just see what I could find. And this digitized page of people with letters at the post office in Michigan in the early 1860s came up. And I knew this was the only Eliza Winston who lived in Detroit at the time. So that's how I found her. That's how I found the other letter, too, from Tennessee.
Also, if you didn't know and you want to do your own searching on Minnesota history, We have a great digital newspaper collection here, newspapers.mnhs.org. You can do the exact same thing.
I'm curious how long their vacation was meant to be.
I'm sorry?
How long was their vacation meant to be?
Oh, I think their vacation was meant to be for the entire summer. I think that, well, I know that the Christmases arrived in early July. And it was during the month of July that Eliza Winston met Emily Gray. But it wasn't until mid-August that she was able to meet with Gray again and a bunch of Gray's friends and give her a plan for becoming free. And the date that Eliza became freed in the courthouse was August 21st. And the sources I've read said that within a day or so, the Christmases left. And a lot of other Southerners left too because they didn't want the judge to turn around and free their slaves too.
And does she have any known descendants?
I haven't been able to come across any. I think that she may have had a child at some point, and that's because, again, going to the tax records, Catherine Golson, she only inherited one slave from her father, and I have not found any record of her buying someone on her own in Tennessee. But there she was in 1847 with the number 2 listed for the number of slaves that she had. So unless there was a purchase of someone that was undocumented, that second slave must have been Eliza's child. But when I looked at a tax record for Mr. Golson in the 1850s, the number of slaves at that point reflected that there was not a child anymore. So I think the child must have died at some point. She definitely didn't have any children once she was in Mississippi.
You mentioned researching tax records and probate court records and other deeds in various states. I can't imagine that all those records from the 1800s were digitized. So were you actually physically going through the books of handwritten records?
No, they actually were digitized. There's this great website called familysearch.org. It's free, and it has digitized county records from just about every county in the state. Now, some of them you don't have access to unless you go to a Mormon family research site. I've had to do that for a lot of people in Louisiana, but there's a site right in St. Cloud that I can go to, which is where I live. But for the counties having to do with Nashville, I think that's Davidson County, I was able to go to Family Search for that. I don't remember if that website had Shelby County, but Shelby County's recorder office actually did have their own records digitized, so I could go to the county website for that. That's where I found the one about Andrew Jackson.
I'm interested in hearing more about Emily Gray. So she was a free black woman who was very involved in the abolitionists. I mean, I would imagine there was a public face to what she was doing. Did you come across a lot of records about her activities?
Well, there were at least one or two that I found that were from Minnesota, because Minnesota Historical Society had digitized an article that I believe was an autobiography of her. Something about her in her own words. I know there was something written about one of her relatives, or written by one of her relatives about her. But Emily Gray came to Minnesota from Pennsylvania. She was a second-generation free person because her father had been born enslaved but became free. And So Eliza got some of her abolition spirit from him because as a child, she would see her parents welcoming enslaved fugitives who were trying to escape the South. And once Emily got to Minnesota, she became connected to some of the people who felt the way that she did. Now, there was no consistent abolition activity in the Twin Cities at the time, which is why Eliza was the first and only person that was freed in Minnesota. But there were certainly people who were anti-slavery in Minnesota. They were known for going to where ships were arriving and booing the slaveholders who were disembarking with their slaves. But as far as organizing to specifically get an enslaved person free, they didn't do that until Emily presented them with Eliza's story. Because once Emily was able to say, no, this person really does want to be free, she said so, then the abolitionists said, okay, if she really wants to be free, we'll free her. So that's why they did. They had to hear it from the enslaved person that they really wanted to be freed. Otherwise, they weren't going to interfere.
Was there anything in correspondence to and from the Christmas family or her previous enslavers that referenced her and what her life might have been like?
I haven't come across any correspondence between Eliza and her previous, or any of her enslavers.
No, I didn't mean between Eliza and the enslavers. I meant the Christmases were here for the summer. Was there any correspondence back to family and friends in Mississippi or between any other enslaver families and their families referencing Eliza, particularly the Christmases after she was freed?
Oh. One of the only things that I could find in terms of dialogue reflecting the Christmases and the loss of Eliza was several Southern newspapers saying, Minnesota did us dirty. They take our money and then they free Eliza. There was one paper from January of 1861, though, that claimed that Eliza had enough of being alone in Detroit and went back to Mississippi to the Christmases. But I haven't found that to be true, especially because, again, I found a letter postmarked to Eliza Winston in Detroit. I also found her name in a city directory in Detroit in 1862. So there was no way that she could have gone back to Mississippi in 1861.
I guess looking at the time period, this is coming up close to the Civil War. And so did you find that these families were still coming from the South to Minnesota during the Civil War with their enslaved persons? And then was there also instances of enslaved people just running away while they were here, not actually filing for some type of emancipation or manumission?
What I found in my research was that even after Eliza Winston was freed in Minnesota, there were still people who kept their slaves with them in hotels in Minnesota. And those enslaved people were not freed. In fact, there was something I came across for Slavery's Reach, which was a story about a group of enslavers taking a hunting trip even farther north into Minnesota and taking their enslaved people with them, and then coming back to the Twin Cities and then ultimately going back to the South. And I think there was one person who, in early 1861, made the trip from Alabama, to Minnesota, but that was weeks before the Civil War began. Once the Civil War begins, Southerners generally leave Minnesota, go back to the South because now they have to defend it, or at least they have to defend the Confederate states in the South. And once that happens, it totally kills Minnesota's tourism market. Within a year, the Winslow House closes. There's a hotel in Stearns County, the Stearns House, that closed within a year as well. There was just no Southern clientele to keep the tourism economy going. So, but it wasn't Eliza being free that killed the market, it was the Civil War that killed the market.
Did you find any information that any sources that she might have gone to Canada or looked into any Canadian records?
Well, that was my original thought, that when she was able to get connected to the Underground Railroad, once she left Minneapolis and went to St. Paul and then went from St. Paul to Detroit, did she stop at Detroit or did she go to Canada? There were some newspaper reports that said that she did. There were some that said that she just stayed in Detroit. And once I found the post office article and I found her name in the Detroit directory, I figured, well, she must have just stayed in Detroit.
All right, one last question here. Yeah, we got time.
Thank you again. So I'm struck in the references to Emily and Eliza. In the introduction we got, it has Emily approaching Eliza, but in Eliza's affidavit, she said she sought out Emily. And I wondered, would there be would that discrepancy be to protect Emily in some way, or should we just trust the affidavit?
Well, what I understand as far as the context for their first meeting is that Merry Christmas actually needed to have one of her dresses altered by a tailor in St. Anthony, and she sent Eliza with the dress to go find a tailor. And so Eliza went to Eliza's shop, and that's where she met Emily for the first time. And Eliza told Emily her story, and Emily said, you are free. Let's see if I can help you actually get free.
Well, once again, round of applause for our speakers, Dr. Lehman and Dr. Rodriguez.